everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the ReNouned podcast. This is episode 5, and we are your hosts, Mark Schulz
and Alison Hager.
ReNouned podcast is a podcast for the curious. We dust off the commonplace and we look for shiny new relevance as we challenge ourselves to think critically about the objects that surround us. How do they echo humanity's past, reflect the present, or even foreshadow the future? How are you doing, Alison?
I'm good. How was this week for you?
It was good. I'm still noticing my patterns. I'm noticing when I push off some of the work and research, when I find those moments that I'm like, no, I love this, so I want to dig into it, versus those moments after work where you're like, do I want to do this? Yeah. Anyway, it's still fun. And I still love making myself dig into it, because once that ball starts rolling, those rabbit holes are deep, as you well know.
They certainly are.
How was your week?
Yeah, this was a challenging one for me. We'll get into it a little bit as we dive into the episode, but it was a difficult one. I spent a lot of time, and I felt I had a hard time finding the right hook. So
no, me too. I mean, I think I finally got there. I'm sure we'll figure that out. But it's interesting, audience, just to share. I don't know if Alison wants me to say this, but she texted me a couple of times. I hate this freaking word. And it's funny because, in our little recipe here for the show, we got to roll with that, right? I don't think we want to change it. That's kind of against the spirit of challenging ourselves to go with whatever random word. For anybody new to the show, right? We got a random noun generated for us from a website that we use. And that's it. That's our path.
And I love the random factor. It's one of my favorite things about our process, because you never know what you're going to find and what you're going to learn that you might not be interested in. But this week, for whatever reason, was a big challenge for me. So the word this week, is a reminder to everyone who listened last week, is highway. And I think we can jump into it there.
Wait, I'm gonna laugh for a second, just because I don't know. We might have even said this in one of the first episodes. I mean, we're still in some of our early episodes, obviously, but when we got construction, I can't remember if you said it during the show here or not, listeners. Alison said to me, gosh, I hope we don't get another word like construction. I don't know, like high. I swear you said something like highway. Unless I'm just, making that up now in retrospect. But so I remember when the word popped up, I generated the word last week. I feel like that echoed in my head, and I can see it painted all over your face. It's like, oh God.
I know the universe just likes to play some fun jokes on people, on us maybe especially.
Right. But we'll see. Yeah. Just to tease up. Oh, sorry. No, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Go ahead. No, please.
I was just going to say, I feel like, again, that's part of the recipe. That's why we rate our words. I don't know, reading from your reaction, it may not have changed that much. We'll see. But I feel like sometimes we'll go into it being like, this word sucks, but we'll find some hook. We'll be surprised, and it'll be something very, very different. Not always. I have a sneaking suspicion that may not have happened for you this week, but we'll see. I know for me, I definitely, yeah. It took a while for something to click. I think I got somewhere where it galvanized me. Is that the right word? I think so. A little bit more by the end, but.
Well, let's find out. So as a reminder to everyone, Mark and I both roll a die, and the highest roll is the one who goes first for each of our segments. So let's get to it. What'd you get, Mark?
A 3.
I got a 3 as well.
We never talked about what happened. Just re-roll.
I think we roll again.
Hoyt. Wait. Hoyle. Hoyle's rules. Just kidding. Hoyt. Who's Hoyt?
Call our friend Craig.
4.
2. So you go first.
So what we do? Like you, me. You, me.
Now you.
I think.
Yeah, so we're almost even.
All right.
Let me get my clock ready. So the first segment is always what we call just the hits. And each of us has 15 seconds to kind of summarize the direction we're going in. And we time each other. And we still haven't figured out how to loudly buzz each other if we go over. But I think
I'm sure
the fear of that, we've gotten better of actually sticking to the 15
We run
seconds.
A little timer for 15 seconds. Mm-hmm. And so my little alarm will go off at the end. But yeah, I'm not sure if the mics will pick it up. But
I'm going to hold this right by the mic.
But no, I love that you
case.
reminded the audience of that. Yeah, we're wordy, and some of this is to really set that seed, right? Try to reflect what was the core of our research or our thinking for the week. So, all right, yeah, I will jump in with my 15. I'm confident this time I got it nailed down.
Well, now you're just tempting fate. So I'll count you down in 3, 2, 1.
A highway is one of the most used or most important paths from one location to another. How we have constructed them over time reflect both the highs and lows of human industry.
4 seconds to spare, Mark. I think it might be a record.
Woo! I know part
fantastic.
of our challenge here, though, is it might make it hard for you to like focus and hear what I said. But
I think the timer helps because
the timer helps, right? Yeah.
I don't have to watch it, and then I know. Then I can look once I pause it to the time. So
and we can go through it. So let's do yours, and then we can compare and contrast a little bit.
All right, tell me when.
All right, 15 on the clock, and go.
While highways are integral to commerce and community, their planning and development was often antithetical to both. Done.
6 seconds left. You're just oozing optimism on this word. It's just oozing out of you.
I know. I just kind of want it to be over with. I'm kidding. I love it. I love the podcast and the process. But as I mentioned, you're going to hear me say it the entire time. This word is a challenge for me.
It's good that we can be so passionate about certain words. All right.
Okay.
So, I mean, yeah, if we're thinking about how the different approaches, you went into, it felt like more administration and planning of them, right?
Mm-hmm.
A little bit. I mean, I know we're not going to get there, but just comparing.
No, absolutely.
Like we both mentioned, we both have a sense of, I said, how we have constructed them reflects highs and lows of industry. So I feel like we might have similarities maybe in some of the hows. It feels like we went to like a stuff and a materials versus broader.
I think mine goes more to an impact, but I think what probably we will have in common is sort of how we got there, like how we got to the expansion of highways, which might be something that overlaps.
All right.
But let's find out. Okay. Take us away down your rabbit hole.
Down my rabbit hole here. All right. So I kind of, as I mentioned, as we both sort of talked about, I've tried to find my hook. I tried to find what interested me as I started to dig through this. And not that I have a really set process yet. I feel like I'm finding that. Maybe you are too. Like as we approach this, you really are just starting from where can we go? And I know in one of our other episodes, we talked about we're both using resources from the New York Public Library and through EBSCO probably, and JSTOR, probably some of the other big databases for these things. But there's also just good old, Googling, and there's I think I find a combination of starting with broad Google stuff and then finding a topic that I feel like I then go validate a little deeper through something like EBSCO, or the Holy Grail is finding research papers where there's like an academic approach to it. Anyway, so that's a little bit of the process. And so as I started meandering my way around, here's where I went, and then I feel like I found a path. So not a surprise, I started with etymology and looking at like what does this thing mean? So highways in regards to roads, and speaking about the most frequented or the most important roads, that first entered use in 1200. The figurative sense of taking the high road versus like a highway, that figurative sense really didn't come in until like 1793. I feel like you and I might have at the end of last episode mentioned something about like a high road. Now there was like a king's high road, which is very different, but the idea of like, I'm going to take the high road, that figurative sense did not come around until 1793. So 1200s for frequented or important in English. Old English, HEH or HEAH was of a great height or tall. It was the word high. And it's interesting, I called this out just because in a lot of our etymological conversations in the past, we would end up hitting Latin. Here, I feel like this word is really taking us back through Proto-Indo-European and not going south, going like literally like Latin through. The word high, they think comes all the way back through to a Lithuanian word meaning hill.
Ah,
And then the Old English WEG, for probably pronounced way, if the G isn't hard, probably, is a road, path, or a course of travel, that is. And that came from Proto-Indo-European WEGH, to move or transport. So I just love that. Yeah, we're kind of staying clear in sort of the Latin roots here, the Romance part of the tree. So I then started to look for, I dug a little deeper. And another thing that I love, I keep shouting out New York Public Library, is we have access through the library to the Oxford English Dictionary. So that, I love that resource, of course, just because it really is one of the most tried and true deep resources. So it gives you a list of when some of these words were when we first have record of them. So this was a fun little, I can almost look at my today's rabbit hole in two parts. This is part one, and then the other one takes a very different approach. But the earliest known use of highway was as HEIWEG, highway, and it came from something that I didn't know existed, which was this collection of charters related to the Church of Canterbury. And so this collection of church charters, referencing roads and other things like that, pre-Norman, I had to remind myself, went back as before 1066. So this list of, and it's available in a couple different sources online for free, is a list that's incredibly difficult to read, not a surprise, in Old English, but is a pretty fascinating list from, I want to say it starts around, I think it started around like 700, but runs through 900. And you can just see them dated in a row. And so the use of, in the year 859, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation here, but it's like Orienta Synergis Highway to Skufellingford. Again, any linguistic academics out there are screeching and pulling their
please
hair out.
help. Yeah.
Right? Please help. And, don't douse yourself in too much gasoline and set yourself on fire at my pronunciation. But so breaking that down, which I thought was pretty fascinating, the Oriente is Eastern. Synergis is, I think, signet ring, that root, sinnage, or sinig, is king, and highway is highway. So this was an Eastern king's highway. To Skufellingford was apparently a town in Kent, which I looked, it doesn't still exist. But since these were all to do with the Church of Canterbury, which is in Kent, I just thought that was pretty cool. So that was really the first recorded use from 859.
Wow.
So that dates, way back. So it was another 400 years or so before we have another record of highway being used to refer to the most direct route from one location to another, right? Before that, it was all a system of roads maintained by the monarchy, which is why you notice I mentioned the King's Highway in particular. So that far back, it was connected to the monarchy, maintained and kept up by them. Another 400 years later, you start to refer to it more broadly as just, as we would talk about here, a highway from one place to another. That was this most, traveled route. And that spelling was slightly different. My understanding is that it's so liquid and fluid, the spellings of the time, but that was a capital HEYWEY. So a bit different. And that was more this broad sense of highway. So where I'm going to go from here was a lot of those roads that were considered then 400 years later as the most direct routes were built on the roads built by the Roman Empire. And to this day, the Roman roads, are held up as something that's stood the test of time in their quality, but also the impact that they had on history and the power of the Roman Empire, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to go into that a little bit. And what I'll do in the next section is compare and contrast Roman construction to modern construction. And in doing that, we're going to see, unfortunately, in my opinion, a really insidious negative thing, which I'll call out. Okay, so the quiz question. When was the first road over the Alps built? And you have 4 options, and they're in chronological order from the earliest to the latest. So A, 662 BCE, 74 BCE, 85 CE, or 400 CE.
I have no idea. I'm thinking Hannibal here, but I couldn't even tell you when Hannibal was around. So
again,
I
it's
am going to
662
go
BCE, 74 BCE, and then the switch 85 CE, 400 CE.
84 CE.
Nope, it's BCE, 74 BCE.
Oh, I almost went with 74. Always,
Like,
always go with your first thought on multiple choice. Isn't that the first thing we learn when we're taking standardized tests? And that's what it's going to do. Darn it.
Oh,
okay.
No, you were close. It's the closest option out of the 4, out of the 3. So 74 BCE by Emperor Pompey. And yeah, so part of, he was known so much as not only one of the most influential and powerful emperors, but he had a military prowess that he was known for. And certainly these roads were needed for that reason. Okay, so I'm going to try to breeze through this, talk about the Roman construction, and then I'll talk about modern construction. 2 things that I thought were interesting that I'm going to post in our either the episode notes or on our website in our bibliography for the episode. The Roman construction in How first was kind of fascinating. They used 2 things to make sure that these roads were navigated straight, like they were where they needed them. So the Groma, which is a surveying star, and that was used to actually chart the course of the roads, which was done incredibly straight, incredibly accurately from the London Bridge straight through to a town that's, hundreds of miles away, which is wild at that time period. And then also something called the Chorobates, which was used for leveling. Leveling becomes really important in the maintenance of roads, as I've learned this week in research, through avoiding and controlling the effect of water on the road. So you needed to constantly have slopes and ditches and things to siphon water away, so you're not damaging the roads constantly. And if we know, Romans are, of course, known for their roads, but also their aqueducts. They are kind of the masters of moving water around and controlling that. And I feel like a lot of this comes from this leveling thing. So just really briefly, because I had some fun looking these things up. A Groma, picture a stick, and on the top of that stick or pole is a right angle cross. You have to make sure it's at a right angle, and then that's put flat on the top of this pole. And then from each of the 4 points of this cross, a plumb line, a string with a rock or a weight, was hung from each of the 4. So what that allowed somebody to do, right, it seems so rudimentary, but it's pretty genius, is you put that pole in the ground, the plumb lines make sure they're straight down to the earth. And then whoever is holding that sends their buddy about 100 or so paces away with a flag or something that they can mark in the ground. And you use the hanging plumb lines to line them up so that you are looking in a straight line from one plumb over one string plumb overlaps the next to where that person's standing, and you make them mark that because it's a perfectly straight line. Well, obviously it's going to be a straight line if there's 2 points, but to them, but then you can have another person to the right where you use the other plumb lines because you have a straight, a right angle cross. So you can create 90-degree angles over hundreds of, paces or yards or whatever it is.
I think that it's so fascinating. If you watch road crews today, they basically do the same thing. You have a guy holding a stick
and everything else.
Course,
yeah, but it's
the technology is upgraded, but it's a dude with a pole and it's his buddy 50 feet away. That is fascinating.
Isn't it? Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up because I was going to mention that was the first image that came to mind. I'm like, it's wild that it's the physics and the measurements are all the same. It's very cool. The math's the same. So that is the charting course. The Chorobates, you can imagine you're going over terrain. So what they would need to do is actually clear, you're probably going to talk about the environmental impact, but trees, things out of the way, like, well, we could debate what that means for humanity, but you're clearing the path. But then what you would need to do is, it's another use of plumb lines. Picture a rectangular frame that three-dimensional, almost like, a standard dresser shape, right? It's like three-dimensional rectangle that has two diagonal braces near the top. So it's still a right angle in the rectangle, but then diagonal braces. And over each of those is a plumb line that hangs down. And you mark into each of these diagonal beams the straight line when this thing is level. Then, as you are moving along the road, you're dragging that with you. And if you need to go up or down, say you suddenly are on a massive incline or a rock or something happens, you can drag it, you can move it up. You can basically adjust until the plumb lines are back where they need to be, right? So if you picture you put it on top of a rock and it's at a significant angle, 45 degrees or something like that. Well, then you can sort of bring up the other side until everything's lined up again. And then you can measure the distance, and you can just constantly decide the grades that you're going to use. You can have a really small slope. You can decide to keep it completely level for many, many miles if terrain permits. So it just gave them so much control over, keep the road, of course, as flat as possible for as long as possible. But then if you do need to make adjustments, control the slope, because you picture you're either going to have military men marching for many, many miles on this thing. So any slope at all was going to have significant impact on their time, the duress or stress of their body doing this. But also, any of the other non-motorized, of course, vehicles of the time, wheelbarrows, chariots, things like that. So I just thought that was a great reminder. And for me, as part of the spirit of this whole podcast, is like, oh, how again does that work? Like, yeah, we see those guys on the highway. How did this used to work way back when? So I thought that was fascinating. I know it's a little bit of a running off in a tangent, but when these things kept coming up in my reading, I really wanted to take the time to be like, well, what the heck is a Groma again? And what is this Chorobates? So I'll post them. I found these great videos of students in engineering schools, I think like at Ohio State or something, that built some of these and are like out in the backyard outside their dorm, like doing a YouTube video to demonstrate it. It's super fun. So it was cool. Okay. But now let's go into the actual comparison of the construction of the two roads. So here's how classic Roman roads were built. The lowest level was earthen soil, of course, but that was leveled and cleared of all the materials, rocks, trees, et cetera. And it was tamped down by hand so that it was as, kind of compressed as it could be by hand. Again, I mentioned water control was really important. So where they decided the road was going to be, they would then, probably using the Chorobates, control a slope down to either side so that water would flow away from the road that they were building.
And Mark, do you know who was building the roads primarily? Were they using slave labor, or were they using their military forces or a specific road corps?
That I didn't actually see anywhere. It's interesting. You would assume it's probably slave labor, but the videos that I were watching would just mention that there'd be like, that the head architect of the road would be the one actually using the Chorobates, et cetera. Somebody who, was trained, and I doubt they would have educated any slaves to have that type of skill, unfortunately. But maybe from I would guess, anyone who knows, please do chime in on social media. But I'm guessing for like the hard labor of clearing things, I would assume it's a mix. I think it depends. In some of the research I also read, some of my sources were, interestingly, military publications from like the 70s that were talking about the modern, urgent need in military to build a road in war territory and to move quickly. And that, I think, you assume are soldiers doing it fast to get somewhere.
Right.
These largely, I don't think, were built necessarily under those circumstances. So I bet you they had the ability to pull in cheaper labor. Yeah. I guess the cheapest labor.
Understatement. Okay, sorry to interrupt.
No, I love that question. I wish I knew. Mm-hmm. I think I should follow up for you. Or again, if anybody knows, please sound off in social media. We are, it's a good segue. We are ReNouned at ReNouned Podcast on most of our social platforms. So I think we're most active on Instagram, but you can find us on Twitter as well. And of course, renownedpodcast.com. You can send us an email or send us probably like a voice message too as well. We might put you on the show. All right. So after they tamp down this base level, then they have something called the pavimentum. That may sound familiar. So it's about a 1/2-foot layer of sand or small stones that was also tamped down and compressed. And so, from pavimentum, not a surprise, we get current words in most of the modern languages, certainly pavement in English. It's the same word in French, I believe. And pavimentum comes in 2 parts. Part 1 was pavio, which is the first person conjugation of the verb pavere, which is to beat down, basically. Beat down, put a beat down out. But it's like, so I pound, basically, would be pavio. And then the ending -mentum, I love geeking out on words. That suffix is anything that indicates in Latin an instrument, a medium, or the result of something. So, of course, the result of somebody pounding it, paviomentum, pavimentum became the word. And I just love that has followed us through to pavement today. What I thought was fascinating was I was like, oh, pavio is so close to patio. We must have gotten patio from that as well, but that's not true, everybody. Seems like an obvious jump, but patio comes from something about a Spanish outdoor space. So I didn't go down that. I didn't further go down that
you went
side
down a
rabbit
side
hole.
rabbit
I know.
hole.
I was like, I was like almost angry that I'm like, how is it not? Patio must be related. It's not. Anyway. Okay. So the next level is called the statamen, if I'm saying that right. And the statamen was where you get into the use of concrete for the first time. So you had, whereas the pavimentum was, pounded down granite or gravel, basically, right? Different mix of things. This was a cement that was a mixture of stone clippings or shavings, kind of, and combined with a binding agent. So what they called this, and what I didn't realize from Roman roads, but to towers and building structures and everything else, is something called pozzolana, and that's named for the town of Pozzuoli, Italy, where limestone and volcanic ash were mined. And this mix of limestone, volcanic ash with water would, I don't know the chemical reaction, but would create this really hardened cement. And so they would use that. Pozzuoli, Italy is near Mount Vesuvius. So not a surprise that this was a really good source of mining volcanic ash. So they would take 1-foot cubed rocks, things that, it would look a bit like a brick, probably in like a brick shape, but rocks. And they would put them, these 1-foot cubed things, into this pozzolana and put that over the pavimentum. So you get this picture, right? A lot of work, a lot of layers, a lot of certainly intensive, but really stable. You can almost hear it in the way that it's built. So then even on top of this, they put something called the rudis, which is, as you would think from rudis, something a little bit more rudimentary, rude. It's coarse pebbles, rocks, broken bricks, et cetera. And that's also tamped down. And then on top of this is something called the nucleus. And this was a fine layer of gravel and coarse sand, probably the finest thing we've had so far in the road. I could not find if that had a mix of this pozzolana or not. You would think it does, because it needs to sort of, it was sometimes the very top layer, but if you were in nicer areas, if you were building a road closer to the cities or something like that, in this nucleus, top layer, they said it's called a summum dorsum. Summum dorsum, from what I could translate, basically means a summit, or like the highest point, or sum, and dorsum, dorsal fins, things like that, back. So it's kind of like you're creating the back of this road, but it was only done in certain areas. And so that you would have a range of finer stones. If you were in like a really nice area, they would be probably like dark, more probably volcanic rocks, things that are a little bit smoother and shinier, versus igneous rocks. That's what I want to say. Versus, other types of stones. So that's the roads, and many of these still exist to this day, and if anybody on social media lately has seen the Roman meme, you'll see a lot of things where they juxtapose like typical cracked American like highways, well, anywhere really, highways with current construction versus these Roman roads that like stood the test of time to this day. So
it is remarkable. I was several months ago, I was in Croatia and I was in Split. And for anyone who's been there, the center of the city of Split is a complex called Diocletian's Palace, built by Emperor Diocletian. And much of it is in ruins, but many of the walls still stand. And it's a palace complex more than one specific building. And so you walk through the outer walls and you're walking on streets and there are shops, modern day shops and apartments next to you now, but you're within this complex and you are walking on the roads that were built when the palace was built. Like, that's so wild. To your point, and you're walking on these blocks that have been placed. And now I understand what was under them, which is so great. But it blows your mind when you're walking down them and they're still basically level. It's incredible.
Yeah. And you're only going, you go down just a few feet. The last people that touched that were the people that said it. I mean, it's crazy to me.
It's amazing.
All right. Break it up a little bit with another trivia question. That's cool. As we start to move more into modern times. So number 2, as of 2012, about how many miles of roads exist in the United States? Is it A, 250,000 miles, B, 650,000 miles, C, 2.5 million miles, or D, 4 million miles?
2.5 million miles.
It is D, 4 million miles.
I almost cursed very loudly.
Yeah, and so those are roads, not just highways, right. But those are roads, and we'll get into in a little bit why that is concerning to me. So, cost of maintenance as we move into modern things. The cost of maintenance, I think, is an eternal thing, right? There was certainly cost concerns. Granted, they were probably using slave labor, to your point, but there's always cost concerns with any empire, with any government funded thing. So that I think is still the case. Management of water to this day is still a massive concern. That hasn't changed, not a surprise. And how it damages roadways over time. So we still have ditches. The roads, our highways and roads are still built with a slight incline in the middle so that there's a fine grade to things. There is a curve so that things are running off the road itself, but then down ditches and away. So the major concern that I have here, we're going to talk about the role of asphalt versus everything that I just described, which were all, like I mentioned, we're talking stones, gravel. The most processed sort of thing that you had there was the pozzolana, which was still volcanic ash and lime reacting with water, was hardening. But here you have asphalt. And for me, I didn't really know the nature of asphalt, so I hate to admit that for folks that maybe they know it. I certainly knew that when they're paving here in New York City, if you get a whiff of that stuff when they're rolling it, it is intense and it feels noxious as hell. But I still really didn't know what it was. So I'm going to hopefully educate folks here on this a little bit.
Great.
So the lowest level, if we're building from the ground up, as I just did for Rome in modern times now, obviously you go down deep enough, you're on the earth. So earth and soil, and we're still compressing that, of course, as much as we can. The compression of that is actually pretty important, and monitoring how humid or the moisture level, even at that level for long-term planning is in there, is important. The next two, 1 and 2 here, there's a sub-base course, and that is optional. Sometimes you need it, sometimes you don't. And I think it has to do with what I just mentioned with like the nature of the moisture in the area, because that sub-base course can help with drainage and how it's constructed or built. So that is there or it's not there. But then the next layer is base course, right? So they're both base courses, just a sub if you need it or not, you have a regular. And this is what I noticed in the description is it's interestingly much like the rudis, that the rudimentary layer that was used from the Romans. It's a mix of coarser crushed stones, slag, and other materials that are not really refined. But then we move into level 3, the next layer up, which is a concrete asphalt mix. I'll get into what this means, but it has a lower concentration of asphalt. And then the very top layer is the surface course. That's what we're driving on. And that is a dense grade asphalt concrete, much higher in concentration of asphalt. And what makes a really good surface course, right, is it needs to be as waterproof as possible. It's got to be very smooth, frictionless, as compared to chariots or marching men hundreds of, thousands of years ago. Now, of course, you can imagine even a slight friction for roads, given the amount of vehicular traffic we have, would be a big deal for everything from degradation of cars to everything else. Now, I'll get to, there are ways I think we need to, anyway, there are ways I think we need to achieve these things like waterproofing and smooth and frictionless and flexibility, and it's not in the way that we probably went about it. Trivia question 3, Alison. This is a little weird, but choose the right combination of year and nationality of the scientist that first laid asphalt.
You're giving me a multi-part multiple choice question?
So it's going to be
on a topic I hate? Okay, go ahead.
So E, 1978, French. Right. So it's the year.
Wait, what was the question again? I was too busy bitching about it. Go.
The year, I'm going to name a year, and then the nationality of the scientist who first used or laid asphalt.
Okay.
So was it in 1978 by a French scientist? Was it in 1870 by a Dutch scientist? Was it in 1918 by an American scientist? Or was it way back in 1680 with a German scientist?
It was the Dutch dude.
Oh yeah, it was. Well done. Yep. That is...
I feel like I read something about Dutch and highways, which wasn't that, but it just made me go with Dutch.
1870 Dutch. The little trick here was, although he was Dutch, the asphalt was laid. Excuse me, everyone. The asphalt was laid in Newark, New Jersey.
Oh, yeah. I think I read that too somehow. I mean, I never would have remembered it if you hadn't asked me the question.
No. But... yeah, right. Interesting enough, 1870 Dutch scientist, but in Newark, which is interesting that we both live in New York City. We're not far away. And then a year later, he was contracted to also pave a section using this asphalt by the White House, contracted by the White House to pave a section of Pennsylvania Avenue. So here are some things. In 1870, that first chemist created asphalt as a mixture of concrete and a substance called bitumen, bitumen, bitumen.
Bitumen? I could be wrong.
Bitumen, I'm not sure. Bitumen, perhaps. Also known as tar. So he, in 1870, used naturally occurring tar from tar pits, for example. And this combination, better controlled the water. It allowed for the flexibility and support and the smoother surface that we see today. However, here's where things get, in my opinion, a bit nefarious. However, within 30 years, this naturally occurring tar was replaced with bitumen or bitumen, created as a byproduct of petroleum processing. And so you suddenly have major oil companies producing and selling asphalt within, the turn of the century, around the 1900s. So here we have another, in my view, right, a really significant way in which the oil industry secured itself and became yet another part of literally the infrastructure of America that, to me, to this day, I had never thought of or realized. I think of them more in the exhaust from cars and engines and that type of thing, used for propulsion, not realizing that it was baked in quite literally into our roads. And since that time period. And so even though we now know, and I'm saying at the time, I don't think they realized what was happening, but I think unfortunately what we know now is that they are so ingrained in the lobbies and we can't extricate ourselves from fossil fuels and our reliance on them. And it's a massive problem, as we can imagine. So yes, we know now that it's a cleaner solution than coal, but it still, as we know, has devastating environmental effects. So I'll leave on not a very upbeat topic, but to make it worse, in 2020, the New Scientist reported a study that warns that our asphalt road surfaces themselves may soon be a greater source of dangerous air pollution than the cars driving on them. asphalt samples were heated in a lab environment from 40 degrees Celsius up to 200 degrees, and measuring the emissions that were given off from the asphalt itself. And going from even just 40 degrees to 60 degrees Celsius more than doubled the emissions. And the impact of direct sunlight on the asphalt even tripled the emissions. And you need to realize when you're looking at about 60 degrees Celsius, that's the average temperature in California of roadways. So you have all the space, right? And not only is that bad now, but what they're warning about is this is likely going to get so much worse as we see the effects of climate change significantly rising in combinations of heat waves, but also, just as we know, our average temperatures are rising. So what they are warning about is these emissions, right? They're carbon-based pollutants that are being emitted into the air. And although they didn't follow this through, right, the scope of this study did not do this yet. But if you rely on known science that exists and known knowledge, what they're saying is these will most likely, like almost definitely, create aerosols in the atmosphere that form tiny particles. I learned this yesterday, I think, tiny particles that are called PM 2.5s. And what that means is they're particulate matter, PM, of 2.5 microns or less in diameter. And that is like this threshold where you cross over into something being inhalable for humans. And so that particulate matter, that size, these PM 2.5s or less, are considered the most dangerous to human health. So, here you have this very unfortunate framework of it's happening, you can see it measured, and now you can assume, based on scientific knowledge, they're going to form this type of particulate matter that is one of the most dangerous to humans. So, to round us off with a very dark trivia question, number 4,
when are we all going to die? Sorry, go ahead.
Your favorite word this week, and I'm making it worse. What percent of our U.S. roads, those 4 million roads that reach 4 million miles of roads, what percent are not paved? Is it A, 1%? Is it B, 4%? C, 12%? Or D, 32% are not paved?
32%.
Is 4%.
You're kidding. Like even all roads, country roads, like every road. That's like mind blowing.
Yeah. So actually. 4%, which means that 96% are paved. And of those paved roads, 5% have concrete surfaces. I didn't get into that, but asphalt isn't always used, but only 5%, right? So 96% of 4 million roads, 4 million miles is paved. 5% of those are concrete. The other 91% use asphalt. So running the math there, you've got 3,640,000 miles of asphalt roads with a significant potential to damage the environment through emissions. So you can see why New Scientist is raising an alarm.
Thanks, Mark, for just making this week so much better.
Captain Buzzkill. I hope it's interesting. I hope it is, alarming and helps, raise concerns. For me, I definitely sat here right in this chair and thought, shit.
Never going outside again.
Right. Well, not an angle on human construction and pollution I would have considered. And here we have like just the roads themselves are just beating off like.
Didn't know they did that. That would be an interesting angle to take.
Oh God, audience, we're probably just going to keep that in and not even edit it out because it's funny. They're just beating off horrifying particulate matter and you're breathing it in. So there we go.
Mark, I thank you for at least making me laugh because as I've mentioned approximately 50 times already, this word just was killing me. And actually now it turns out it is probably killing me.
Ha ha. Why am I laughing? I guess we have to.
Everyone else. We're in episode 5 now, right? And I will say, like, listening to you talk, I love the etymology piece so much. Also, then I know I don't have to dig really deep on it because I'm pretty sure you're always going to do it. But it's like sitting through a college class, like all the detail, which is great. I definitely learned a lot, and I didn't go down this road of very specific construction. So it was something very
down this
different.
road, bump.
But
Oh,
we love making the puns on this podcast.
funny people.
Puns
Funny
and dad
people.
jokes.
Um,
And musical theater references.
I just have to share, I didn't weave it in, but now I'm going to bring it up because I can't avoid it. Somewhere in my research was talking about piles and piles of things and being used, probably the Roman construction, and I had to laugh at. I could have said piles a bunch of times, but now I've worked it in a good 3 or 4 times in the past 30 seconds.
Which I love. And anyone who didn't listen to our construction episode, this is a reference that we will probably make in every podcast until the end of time, because Mark said piles so many times that I couldn't stop laughing. It's like he didn't know any other words, or he was having a stroke, or both. And it Possibly was amazing.
All right. So I hope I didn't take crazy amounts of time, a little bit, but.
I won't take as long because
you loved this word. This word was your favorite. This word.
No, I struggled hard, but I am with what I came up with. I do think is very important. So, and I took a bit of a narrower path than Mark did. So mine is very US specific. Okay. So now that we know this order went really well, because now we know all about the history of highways and how they're constructed. And now we can come into like, what has the impact been in the US? And I didn't go down the environmental route. So we know that is one impact. And now I'm going to talk about another impact. So just some background. So in 1956 in the US, Congress approved the Federal Aid Highway Act. And that authorized the largest public works project to date, to that date in US history. And the goal was to construct about 41,000 miles of interstate highway across the country and to connect 42 state capitals and 90% of all American cities that had populations over 50,000, excuse me. And President Eisenhower at the time called the massive infrastructure project essential to the national interest. And Eisenhower really had a special place in his heart for this law because in his Army days, he had participated in a cross-country road trip from DC to San Francisco. That happened in 1919. And it was an Army caravan. Just after World War I, it was meant as sort of a victory lap, but it was also very heavily supported by automobile manufacturers, by gasoline companies, by tire manufacturers, anyone involved in the sort of automotive trade wanting to push more automobiles and have more people buy them. They needed better roads for people to buy cars. The military, this was really like a tripartite endeavor. The military also, they had a motor transport corps, and they really wanted to test their capabilities out and to highlight the poor state of America's roads. And that they did. So at the end of this road trip, they had traversed just over 3,200 miles through 11 states in 62 days, and they averaged 52 miles per day. And they had they found just a million problems. There weren't there was not this high percentage of paved roads that Mark had highlighted then. A lot of bridges had roofs too small for all the various vehicles to get through. More than one, from an ambulance to a truck, rolled over in ditches. They just got mired in quicksand at one point. That everything went wrong, and they really kind of saw what a poor state American roads were in. And afterwards, Eisenhower actually wrote, and this was a quote from him, "I think that every officer on the convoy had recommended in his report that efforts should be made to get our people interested in producing better roads." So he was very interested from a very young age. Then fast forward, as Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, when we get to World War II, he saw firsthand how stellar German roads were. And he wrote about that after seeing the Autobahns of modern Germany and knowing the asset those highways were to the Germans. I decided as president to put an emphasis on this kind of road building. So he'd already had a thing for road building since that 1919 trip, but he had been thinking small. He'd been thinking 2-lane roads, let's just make them better. But after World War II and seeing the Autobahns, he thought we need multi-lane, ribbons of road, ribbons of highway connecting this country. And thus the Federal Aid Highway Act. I think it's interesting, Mark, you pointed out there are many instances when roads are a military necessity. Thus we have the Army Corps of Engineers, right? And wartime and road building is often connected. And here's another connection in that way. So the act is passed. the highway expansion happens largely between the late 50s and the early 70s, but really continues up through the 90s.
I had a quick question, Alison.
Yeah.
Because I'm surprised it jumped to the 50s, and you may not have covered this in your research, but totally cool. I would have figured something like that would have been part of like New Deal programming.
There was some roadworks in New Deal programming, but nothing this massive.
Like,
so it would be, yeah, it would be very localized. So this was Eisenhower saying, we need to connect the country. We can't just be focusing on states getting funding to do their own roads. We need to be thinking about it more systemically.
This is like 15 years after the Depression. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. So unfortunately, really positive consequences, but some very negative consequences from the expansion of the interstate system as well. So there's estimates from the U.S. Department of Transportation that more than 475,000 households and more than 1 million people were displaced nationwide because of federal roadway construction. And often new highways would cut right through neighborhoods. There were also other issues, right? It hurt the pedestrian landscape, less of a concern then because you had more people walking who wanted to be driving. But when we think about it now in cities, how things in a lot of American cities are not built for pedestrians, it worsened air quality, it hurt property values. So there were all those. But the biggest thing is it would cut through neighborhoods. And unsurprisingly, the vast majority of people negatively affected were Black and poor. So there's a law professor at NYU named Deborah Archer, and she's researched and written a lot on this issue. And one of her articles is entitled White Men's Roads Through Black Men's Homes, Advancing Racial Equity Through Highway Reconstruction. And she argues that this negative impact wasn't just a consequence, it was by design. So she's not the only person who argues this. She's, this isn't just a thesis coming from her. There's a lot of evidence here. So that policymakers and planners saw highway construction as like a convenient way to raise neighborhoods that were considered undesirable. And besides that, having the excuse to say, well, the national federal good really should take precedent over just somebody's, who's going to be displaced from their home. They could also use the physical aspects of the road, like physical buffers, to isolate communities of color. And if you live in New York, like Mark and me, you've heard of Robert Moses. Robert Moses was one of the most influential urban planners of all time. But post-World War II, here in New York, he was known as New York's construction coordinator. He oversaw all public works projects in New York, from roads to bridges to parks to housing projects. You hear his name and see his name all over New York. He was an urban planner and a state official. He held many different positions over his 40-year career, all related to public works, like Parks Commissioner and chairman of the Emergent Public Works Commission. But his influence on federal highway policy extended well beyond New York. So he was a leading proponent of that idea that the best way to eradicate supposed slums was to build highways through them. And in a 1959 speech, he actually said, quote, "Our categorical imperative is action to clear the slums. We can't let minorities dictate that the century-old chore will be put off another generation or finally abandoned." I mean, he was the chairman of the New York City Slum Clearance Committee. And he said in that same speech that highway construction must, quote, "go right through cities and not around them," right? This idea, he just thought we could kill two birds with one stone here. We can get this built and we can get rid of all what he would consider blighted neighborhoods. In New York, two of the city's main arteries now were his creations, the Cross Bronx and the Brooklyn-Queens expressways. And they did just that, cutting through the heart of the Bronx and Red Hook neighborhoods, and they're still eyesores and blights. Quick trivia question for Mark here. So I don't have as many as he does, and I don't think mine are as difficult, but what recent movie made a reference to Robert Moses and the impact that he had on communities of color? And I'll pause. I'm just enjoying watching Mark's face. And if you're not watching us, you're just seeing him.
I know. I can't think of it. I was just going to, I'm so excited. I found a different thing to bring up pop culture wise. But movie.
I'm giving you a hint. I'm snapping my fingers.
Oh, West Side Story.
Yes. So in the movie remake,
version did a much better job of like showing you the environment of the city. Yeah, that's why.
Yeah, exactly. And really made it clear that both populations. So focused on, right, the kind of Irish, Italian kids and their gang, the Jets versus the Sharks or the Puerto Rican immigrants, were both facing the same, being pushed out of their neighborhoods because of new construction. And there's actually at one point, like protesters, and there's some person holding a sign that says like "Down with Robert Moses."
Oh my gosh. So I don't know if you know this, we have to go now. There's a play opening, a limited engagement here in the city. I can't remember if it's on Broadway but it's a big enough deal because Ralph Fiennes plays Robert Moses.
Really?
And he's playing the character, and it's called Straight Line Crazy. It's a play by David Hare, which is a well-known playwright. So we are going to have to check that out.
I am writing this down. We definitely should. I'm not a Moses fan. So, okay. So we'll go back to that. Stop that. So basically, this whole strategy that Moses had, go right through blighted neighborhoods, displace people, it lets us kill two birds with one stone. The Federal Highway Act ran with his strategy nationally. So they offered to pay 90% of all the highway construction costs for states, so that states wouldn't have to do it, if the states agreed to build them through every major city to connect kind of emerging suburbs and not build around, which a lot of people argued was the better idea. Keep our cities intact and preserved, build the arteries around them, and you're getting the same thing. Said, nope, that's not going to give us what we want here. So instead, he wanted it built through. He wanted to make sure that with the emerging suburbs, you could take commuters and connect them to downtowns. And like I said before, kill two birds with one stone, basically.
I mean, immediately I think of Paris, and I believe it's the périphérique. It's the circular, massive highway that's around. It certainly doesn't go through.
Right.
So that's the difference you're talking about, right? Like, yeah.
That's exactly right.
Paris was treated as a unit, and then everything's around it.
And I believe, I haven't been, so any native Texan, please feel free to correct, but I believe Houston has a series of ring highways. It's the same concept, that the highways kind of ring around the city. And so you can get into it from many points, but it doesn't actually cut through the city. So they get the two benefits they want. They improve traffic conditions and they remove what they consider to be undesirable populations. So now initially displaced residents, primarily people of color, Black and brown people, they're already banned from moving into white neighborhoods, right? By actual law and edict, there was redlining. They couldn't get insurance. A Black family wouldn't be able to get home insurance if they moved into a predominantly white neighborhood. I mean, all sorts of horrible racist policies were in place. So now where are they going to move? They're just going to be pushed into already overpopulated, other under-resourced communities, increasing the slum problem, not improving it. But it was like pushed more out of sight, which is really all that Moses and others seemed to care about. So about this time, thank goodness, the civil rights movement in the US was also gaining momentum. And that meant that Congress and federal courts started to outlaw some of the racist housing tactics like redlining. So bad things are happening because of the highway thing, but things are starting to get slightly better for people of color with the civil rights movement, but not quickly enough, right? So now racists are getting antsy about integrated communities. So now Black and brown folks are being pushed out of their neighborhoods. And if they want to move into white communities, they now have a greater ability to do so. And white racists say, oh, I'm not interested in that. And we start to see white flight. Right. We've all heard of the idea of white flight. So a lot of wealthier whites start to flee to the suburbs, and they can do this now because the highways will connect them to the cities where they work. So before, it wouldn't have been feasible for them to live so far from where they needed to work. But now they know they can commute for work, they can commute for commerce to get what they need, commute for culture, all of that. And these highways bypass what they consider to be undesirable neighborhoods.
Yeah, I ran across that thread in my research too. I mean, you're bringing the civil rights and angle to it, but yeah, I had read that the impact overall was to just like gut the cities because people could be more, obviously with more mobility, they could move out. And now you're explaining why several of them did. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's a lot more detail around this, but some that I won't go into, but Deborah Archer, again, in an interview, this wasn't one of her writings, but she was interviewed in 2021, I think, on NPR. She talked a lot about this. And one of the things she did talk about was like the very intentional building of highways. Sometimes like tying in with this whole two birds with one stone and racism, they were built right on formal boundary lines that had been used during racial zoning. So now when Black folks were going to be more able to move out of those zones, they would purposely build the highways directly there as a physical barrier. It's just, it's absolutely mind-blowing kind of the links that they went to. And again, there's not one person talking about this. There's a lot of evidence here, and a lot of Robert Moses's own words talk about needing to, do this. So, okay, let me get close to wrapping this up. Basically, they use them as a way to skirt the constitutional prohibitions on racial zoning, is what Archer writes. A journalist for the Washington Post, just reinforced that these resulting highways like sped whites back and forth to work, leapfrogging all these minority communities. And the final indignity to me, all of these things are horrible. The highways that were now passing directly through Black communities that displaced a lot of people, cut neighborhoods in half, walled them off, quite literally. On and off ramps weren't built to those communities. So your on and off ramps would get you places that were considered more desirable. So now the people being most impacted didn't even have easy access to the roads. It is, it's yet another horror that we've discovered in the research of highways. And there's examples from Miami to Minneapolis. You can read details about specific neighborhoods and cities all across the US where this has happened and what the impacts were. So the improvement in highways benefited many. It allowed our commerce and trade and our trucking industry, which the lifeline, right, of this country for so long, to be improved. It allowed people more mobility, but it hurt a lot of people as well. And no one kind of really talked about that for a long time. But now, besides politicians, academics, or I was going to say besides academics talking about this, Biden's new infrastructure plan, which was recently passed, relatively recently, actually directly addresses this, not skirting around it. So it includes $20 billion for a program that would, and this is a quote from the White House, $20 billion for a program that would reconnect neighborhoods cut off by historic investments, which I think amazing. Is a very direct comment on this happened, we're going to try to fix it. And it's also, that bill is also looking to target about 40% of the benefits of the climate and clean infrastructure investments that it's covering to disadvantaged communities. So we're starting to see, we're starting to see a recognition of the blatant racist impacts the first infrastructure bill had, and an attempt at redress. I think anyone could argue it's too little, too late, but I am very, very pleased and very proud of our current administration for facing that head on and stating it head on and not trying to avoid it.
I'm so happy to hear that. My mind does jump to when I saw that in some of my research, that infrastructure bill from an asphalt perspective is a huge boon to asphalt. So I think I want to dig a little deeper into that to see if, everything you're saying is amazing. And I'm so glad that it's happening, that it's being funded in the right way, that it's addressing or, redressing some of the things that went wrong. I would love to look into if they are trying to find greener alternatives. It feels like they would be, right? Of the two parties, I would certainly bet on our fellow Democrats to be doing that versus.
It's an interesting question though, because so much of the bill is built around looking right at climate impact. It's not just let's improve our infrastructure. Right. It's in a clean and climate friendly way. But that being said, I don't know the details. Right. And so they're not addressing asphalt.
I'm sure they would have thought of it, but maybe it's just, we're not at a place yet where, you know what I mean? You have to draw the line somewhere on what is achievable within one project. Right. And maybe that's just beyond them yet. Where I left off in my rabbit hole was looking at the future of highway building and industry. And, I literally only saw the word. I don't even know fully what it is yet, other than what it seems to be, talking about geopolymers versus what I described, right? The hydrocarbon base, like petroleum products. You would have other types of things that can give you the flexibility, that can be waterproofing, that can be all these things, but they're green, they're sustainable, they're not damaging, they're not giving off the emissions. So anyway, I think it's interesting to look at big decisions like that infrastructure bill, see the social impact, to your point, that is being corrected or at least addressed brilliantly. But then wondering where was what was possible in the science to like find a cleaner way.
Yeah.
Sorry,
There's
I
a
might have
lot.
cut off your final thoughts.
You didn't. I had already said my final thing.
Good.
So I think we're good. I think we're ready for our big questions. Mark.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, I mean, it's what we're kind of talking about right now as a perfect segue. I wrote literally above this. I think this is a holy grail question, but it feels like an obvious one. How can we how can established industries be effectively motivated to transition manufacturing procedures, et cetera, to maintain their profits and their growth and all the corporate things that are drivers in needs for the street and everything else, the financial industry, not the road or the street, obviously, but to maintain those very capitalistic drivers, but transition to eco-friendly and sustainable outcomes. That's what I mean by like the holy grail. It feels like a no-duh thing, but of course, big oil and those types are entrenched in their ways and feel massively threatened to give that up. So therefore, of course, they're going to take a biased approach to try to poke holes 5 ways from Sunday into every bit of science that has now been so established. But of course, they're not going to give that up because it's just the nature of it. But I guess my big question is, where is the healthy balance between how a government entity or the government can balance the requirements with a coaching and a guidance to help the industries maintain their, it's such a fine line because so many things come up, to help them do it. But also, capitalism is competitive by nature. So if they don't, they evolve or die, and maybe that's fine. But you see what I'm saying? Like, I think there's a fine line for really established industries. Now, I don't want to say too big to fail, that type of thing. But there's a little bit of so big that we need to help them transition because it's just helping the planet. It is saving the planet if we do it, versus just relying on a evolve or fail, pure capitalistic competition model where, yes, the smart startup, total geopolymer breakthrough company we would hope would break in. But I think we know just the nature of the business to break into that. There's so much power in the established industries. I don't even know what my question is there. Does that make sense? How do we as a society let our government help them find a way to do it so that they don't feel so threatened, that they feel like there is an economic incentive to do it beyond just the obvious, maybe let's not all burn up on this rock in outer space by the time we're done. You see where I'm going? Like, how do we do that? And I know that's maybe an ultimate big question for anybody who thinks about the environment.
Yeah, no, I think I completely get what you're saying. And I think we talked about, trying to remember which episode, when we were talking about shopping and we were talking about commerce and that sort of thing. And I was kind of saying, look, to reduce environmental impact, you should, wherever you can, right? Reduce, reuse, recycle. And you were saying, yes, but you'd hate to see a world where that's enforced by the government versus the capitalist system driving this. And I think that's exactly what you're saying here. There's a way for this to be driven within capitalism.
Right. Well,
that benefits
exactly.
everyone.
Like, I think government needs to step up to do it, but doesn't just, especially in this regard, like rather than, it's that fine line. I'm trying to think where I'm going. Rather than force the individual to buy a worse type of car, to not drive as much, to do things that are influencing the quality of life for the individual versus making big, smarter decisions that are more at a systemic level with the companies that are, you know what I mean? That's what I mean. Why make decisions that put the responsibility on the individual who's not connected to it? They're the user. Why are you controlling it through the users versus the providers, like the manufacturers? That feels like a backwards fucking way to do it to me. It pisses me off. Sorry, let's get all rallied up. But that's what I'm saying. And I know that you probably agree and disagree to certain extents. I do see how a bunch of users need to change their ways to telegraph a societal interest and demand it in many ways. Right. But I just think it can't be done by itself.
I agree. No, I actually fully agree with you. I think to your point, we do need grassroots movements. Otherwise, companies and government don't understand that like people are fed up and they are actually going to lose money or support if they don't get their act together. But that's not going to be enough. There need to be incentives at a higher level.
But even that, and I'm still agreeing with you, but even that pisses me off because there shouldn't be the need for grassroots, for the common man or woman to be educating or pressuring the government. I would assume if we had people that were any fucking good at their job to govern the country, be educated enough, they should be guiding us. They should be knowing the correct decisions to make. Not always, but like they should be really. There's, I don't even know where to go. It's like such a big topic, but you know what I mean. There shouldn't be the effect of lobbyists and everything else, which gets us into politicians as a career versus politicians as serving a role. Right. If you're there to make money and it's your job, then you suddenly are biased every which way, rather than being purely objective for what is the smartest science, what is the cleanest technology, what is the best way to build a future. Sorry, got on my little soapbox, but
no, it's important, and we totally agree. Yeah. So I'm going to be honest with you. By the time I got to this point, I was like, I don't even care about the big question. I mean, my first big question thought was, how do we going forward? So everything in life, everything that we choose to do. So let's say you have the best intentions and I don't know, you're only going to buy organic because, this is what you think, there are also negative consequences there. So you can't get organic tomatoes in your neighborhood. So you're buying tomatoes that have to be trucked in, and then there's an impact on the carbon footprint. It's like there's never one easy choice, and you're always weighing different things. So I was just thinking about, we're building highways and we're implementing racist policies at the same time. Like, how do we influence people to make better decisions? That's a ridiculous question. We're never going to, I don't even know. Like, yeah, the world sucks. That's basically where my head was. Like, the world sucks and it's never going to get better. And I was so miserable after like finally finding a direction I wanted to go down and talk about in a story that I thought was important to tell. But then I was so depressed by how absolutely blatant and horrible the building of our highways was in this country. They didn't care. But here's the question I wrote down as a joke, but then I actually read about it a little bit. So my question is, when are we going to have flying cars? And then we can eliminate the need for physical highways. And now I'm more serious because you talked about asphalt. That's like an even bigger problem.
No, that's amazing. We were so on the same page, and I had the same hesitation you did, because I was like, I don't want to end this. Our poor audience is going to be like, now they're talking about little space people flying around this, you know what I mean? Like, not what I mean, but absolutely. One of my other, like my backup big question, sorry to like jump in and just like
no, good.
All the air out of the room, is exactly that. And I feel like so many technologies rely on each other. So we often, I think, as human progress can't just be straight line. Things in chemistry to physics to this, to like, have to gel. So what am I trying to say? Things have to kind of unlock as things level up, so to speak, as they go along. And I do feel like if we want to take an optimistic approach, understanding what's happening now, thank goodness, like this didn't happen. And we were so uneducated as a species that we didn't understand why it was hot all the time and people were dying from 130-degree weather. Like, we just didn't know. Now, again, that wouldn't have happened because we wouldn't have had the cars and education to build things to kill ourselves. But anyway, but that like, I like to think that our education, our sense of industry will find solutions to your point. And I had the same thought of when can we, I just saw some video on YouTube a couple of days ago of basically a jetpack, like a real one that somebody was flying around. I'm like, that's crazy, wild. But when that happens, I'm invested in a company. Now I'm forgetting the name brilliantly, in San Diego, somewhere in California, that are basically flying taxis. These things are slowly, they're still fringe, but they're happening. And if those can be zero exhaust, and to your point, like don't have the infrastructure of highways, yes, you're massive impacts on the ecology, on animals. Scarily enough, on our ability to breathe soon enough, with asphalt and all that. I'm rambling, but I'm just so excited that you had that same question of like, when do we have, that future thing that really does?
Well, it was just really my joke question, because I wanted to say, like, the Jetsons promised us flying cars by like the 2020s. All I know is growing up in the 70s, 80s and watching the Jetsons, I was pretty sure by the time I was an adult, there were going to be flying cars. But it turns out, I only did a little bit of research on this because I was really just messing around, but we could have flying cars. So I didn't know, Mark, that you're invested in a company that's working on flying taxis within 20 years.
Yeah.
Like, it's not as far off. It is not as fantastical as it sounds. Now, most people won't have access to them. It's going to, of course, there's going to be a lot of work. Right. Like, how do you regulate them? How do you have, safety, like skyways and safety? But it is much closer than I had assumed. So that was my big question.
Yeah. Yeah. Now this is, I've been doing a lot of reading on the theory of everything and physics and everything else. And, given the insane, building momentum of our knowledge and our breakthroughs and et cetera in the past couple hundred years, I don't think it's unheard of to say, like, if we survive as a species in another few hundred years, we may understand how to build wormholes. We may understand how to manipulate physics and space-time, the fusion of that understanding in ways that transportation is immediate, like literally things we dream about in like Star Trek and stuff, shit like that. Imagine that if that was a clean technology and it was instant. Think of the massive social upheaval, to your point. Like, it's like the ultimate big questions. If things happen too quickly, like if we cured death tomorrow, religions would lose their minds and like there'd be massive chaos. I've always wanted to write a play or a movie about like if that happened and people
actually that would be fascinating. I think that should be your next artistic project.
Anyway, I don't want to ramble on, poor audience. I know we're at about our time here, about an hour and 20, I think, or so.
We are. So Mark, why don't we go to you on we've talked a lot throughout this episode, how we felt about this week, but this is the time we usually just throw in like, okay, not rating yet again, but leading right into that. But like, your process, how was it different? Anything else you want to add? Anything else you read that isn't related that you want to share?
I guess just my gut reaction is I'm now actually, after talking to you, I'm kind of like pumped. I'm like, yes, it's dark, but the level of like engagement and things you're bringing up with the flying taxis and like, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know. I'm much more engaged. It's not as bad as it was, but the first word I wrote here, all in caps in my recap notes, were bleak. It's bleak. It's how I felt when I,
how I feel in general about this whole thing. Yeah.
God. Well, we're at a rough time in general in the world right now, much less like digging into this. I mentioned this a few times. You echoed this. Hard to find an angle, a hook. I figured it would be more about the social and economic role of roads. Now, you took a very important look at that. I was thinking more historically and like the social growth in Europe from the Roman Empire and the roads, et cetera. But I didn't. That just didn't click into place for me. And I just feel like the path I found through my research led to this. But, learning about bitumen or bitumen and its role was a big deal for me, I guess, like quite literally foundational in how I've gotten around my whole life and not really ever understanding what was in there, and how it's connected of all things to big oil, and yeah, and so that just feels a little eye-opening to me, while it is also a bit depressing, for sure. How about you?
Yeah, no, just I think I've probably overstated how miserable I was this week with this word. And while I'm very happy I came to the part I did, it took me a long while to find that.
Yeah.
I thought I would just share, like, from here are some other roads I thought I might go down, and then each one of them to me seemed not to be enough, or like meaty enough or connected to enough. But the initial thing I thought when we first got the word was, I'll talk about highwaymen who were robbers and all of that. And there's a ballad, a poem, the Highwaymen by Alfred Noyes. And I thought that'll be interesting. But then as I started thinking about it, the highwaymen who robbed people once there were main roads, often quite violently.
Yeah.
They were often romanticized in ballads and stuff. And I didn't want to add to that. I just didn't want to like talk more about that and the romanticization of violent criminals. So I didn't go that way.
Why ever not?
It's like that Brady Bunch episode where Peter Brady is like obsessed with Jesse James and he's really like romanticizing it. And his parents are trying to teach him like outlaws in the West were criminals. They killed people. You shouldn't look at him as a hero. And then he finally has this dream sequence where he's back in the 19th century train with his family and gets robbed by Jesse James's gang. And it was like that. Like,
I feel like Robin Hood had an impact there. Like obviously Robin Hood himself, like as a character,
but he was not a highway
pristine, but although he did highway heists basically in the same manner, it was not the same purpose, the same stuff. But I just feel like that is in the popular conscious.
Right. And I did think, actually, can I tie it into Robin Hood? But because he was considered like from that time period, like the roads wouldn't have been as developed then. So then I was thinking
wait, sorry to cut you off. I just wanted to mention a word I never knew of. I ran across a similar thread. So apparently highwaymen operated on horses exclusively. A footpad would be the same thing, but just on foot. And I have
that in my notes too, because when I thought I would go down that, and then I went, nah. So the other thing that's interesting, I think the first highway in the colonies, when the US was still colonies and it was commissioned by the king in England, it's called the King's Highway. So Mark just even, is in that recent in history, kings were developing highways, and it runs from like New England. I don't know exactly where, because I didn't go this direction, but like all the way down to Virginia. It's called King's Highway, runs through a major part of New Jersey, which is the state I grew up in. And it has a lot of history along that route, runs through Philadelphia. Thought that might be interesting, but there didn't just seem to be enough of a through line for a story there.
Any of I-90 overlaps that. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, I don't know, because I'm going to look closely enough.
Did I just screw that up? I-90 is our major highway along the East Coast, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry. I haven't driven in a long time being a man.
Then I was thinking about like highways and crime, and there's a stretch of a highway in Canada called the Highway of Tears, basically is its nickname, where over 40 Indigenous women have been found murdered or have gone missing over the decades. And a lot of those have not been investigated. We go back here to racism and police being less concerned with Indigenous populations. And it hasn't been solved to this day. And none of them have. And so
we just had Indigenous attacks, right?
And so I just thought, there are enough true crime podcasts out there, so I don't really want to go down that path. And then I thought, it might be in a future episode, but because it wasn't solved, and then I thought it's just so depressing. And again, there are a lot of true crime podcasts out there that actual journalists run that would be much better done. And I'm sure there's a podcast
crime
out
as a
there.
Noun spit out of us, and who knows.
But I'm sure there is a podcast episode somewhere out there on the Highway of Tears. And then I thought, highway, it's used in so many kind of pop songs and rock songs and folk songs. There could be like an amazing story, but each one I looked at, I was like, well, then I'm going into telling the story about this band or this thing, and it didn't seem right. And exactly. So I listened to a lot of songs though while I was continuing the research. And then finally I thought, oh, wildlife highways. So wildlife corridors, which are very important for migrating animals, and our highways often cut them off. So now we sometimes build over or under our highways. And then I thought, well, I did that whole thing on ants. And so I don't want to just go back. So there you go. Like these were all this is why all week I was just going out of my mind, because I thought I would find a hook. And I'm like, this isn't going to work. And also, I just hate this word so much. So I'm glad I came to where I did, but I really did not enjoy the process. But one thing I did, so I was I needed some soothing, like being like miserable and angry at the word. And then my final topic is so enraging that I was just like so angry about it. And so I thought, I need some music to regulate my mood. And there are many studies that music helps regulate stress. It decreases your cortisol levels. It decreases adrenaline. It increases dopamine. So I was listening to all these great songs about highways, some songs I haven't heard forever. And, one of my favorite, Carefree Highway by Gordon Lightfoot, just people go, if you just want to feel good, go listen to it. It is so beautiful.
We'll have to post some of the links on the site.
Well, so I've made a song playlist, all with songs from Highway that we will put on the website if anyone wants to go down the little highway.
You're gonna need it after this update.
Exactly. I needed it. So I thought I'll do that. It has Gordon Lightfoot. It has Skyway by The Replacements, one of my favorite songs from when I was a teenager. It has Bob Dylan and Johnny Cash and BB King, and
amazing.
Just go
like
listen to it and chill out.
Cleanse after our pollution,
which is what I needed.
Racism.
Exactly. Mark and I really brought everyone down today. So, okay, Mark. So all of this, you rated this initially, you rated Highway as a 6. So where have you come out?
This is going to shock you because you hated the word so much, and I don't think you would want to engage in it because it feels like a ticking bomb that I didn't know was right literally under our feet. I will now watch this thread in the news or in, do check in on it now and again to see if we've made progress. So I'm going to go to an 8. Like this is, I think, because there's just so much roadway and it's just now passively emitting. And if we need to change, it just feels like such a perfect model of how we need to find ways to upgrade quite literally our core infrastructure in ways that are green and sustainable.
All right. So 6, 2, and 8. So I was at a 5 and I already thought I was rating it too high because I just wasn't excited when it came out.
-20.
I'm going to drop it to a 2. And I mean, we talked about all this. I learned so much from your piece. I think what I talked about is really important for people to know about. I just didn't care about so many of the things I read.
No, I get it. Gosh, I'm already blanking, but it was glory for me, I think. Like when I went down a similar path where it was just depressing. But I just didn't want to think about it. Although I think it's important, kind of what you're saying, I just want to revisit it. Is that what you mean? You just don't.
That is exactly what I mean.
You need to go back.
I'm glad I learned. I'm glad you gave me such an education on the history of construction, and I'm glad I really know what I know now. And I think it's important for us always to be thinking about impacts on society. But I'm glad that this one is over.
Right. I have a question I'm just going to put out that I think we both should keep an eye on. And audience, I invite you to weigh in, sound off on social media, go to the site, let us know how you feel. There's going to be a lot that we uncover that I think, unfortunately, will be upsetting, but we'll see. At least I don't want to speak for you and your process. I will probably need to, if that starts to happen, not spread sugar on things, not ignore things, but I'll try to probably actively balance when I see that something's really concerning. Where is there a thread of hope? Not negating the negative, so to speak, right? Not ignoring that and acknowledging how horrible that is, but I'll just to function. I'm gonna have to weigh in to lean in. I'm sorry to some of the good,
No, I think that's important. And that's why I wanted to end mine today with the Biden infrastructure plan and how they are
Yes.
actually trying to address this to make it like a little something. But then that's also why I was like, I just need music because I can't think about this anymore. And I don't mean I was trying to push it away and go, this is an ugly thing and I don't want to think about it, so I'm going to
Right.
pretend it doesn't exist. It was actually like a mental health break because
Yeah.
I was so incensed and so depressed. And it just had to get through it. So, okay, 6 to 8 for Mark and 5 to 2 for me.
Yes. I'm going to
Are
make
we
you send me
ready?
that playlist like ASAP. Probably tonight. I'll just chill out to it.
You're going to be watching a
Um,
Marvel movie, don't lie. Should I give us our new word? Are you
yes.
ready?
Let's
I'm
do
actually
it.
like sick to my stomach because I'm terrified.
Oh my gosh. I
It's
know. Like it's going to be.
all right. No, it's no,
You
no, no,
hate
no,
it.
no.
Oh,
I don't hate it. I actually, it sounds, I think, kind of boring, but now I'm already thinking of things that I think are going to be so cool. The word is production.
oh, oh gosh. It's so abstract. Okay. Well, not, you know what I mean? Well, it is abstract. It's a process. Oh God, there's a million places to go with that. Oof. Cool. Oh,
What do
sorry.
you think?
I'm first, right?
You are, yes.
I've done that like 3 times in a row. We really do prepare, audience, and then suddenly
Yeah.
Alison looks at me like, Mark, what the fuck? Um, uh, okay, production. That it's just right in the middle. It's a 5 for me. I'm not sure what to do with it yet, but
Okay. I'm going to go with a 6. I think this is exactly opposite of last week where you were a 6 and I was a 5. Because when I first saw the word, I'm like, it just sounds like another word like construction or highway. Ugh. But now that I think about it, I think there's so many threads here because there's so many meanings for that word.
right.
And so I do think actually it will be really interesting and that there will be many different hooks to follow. So the problem won't be what am I going to do? The problem will be, how do I narrow this down?
Right. No, you're right. It's starting to jump my mind as well. My background from a career perspective, I've spent time as a project manager, which is about, intense procedure processes to produce things and like, or a service. Yeah. There's a lot to do. Yeah. Anyway. So I don't know if that's where I'll go, but like, yeah, right away that kicks in. All right.
All right. Well, before I read us out, Mark, any closing thoughts?
No, I know this felt like we kept saying bleak, but I'm actually leaving very energized, right? I loved our conversation. Audience, I really hope you did too. I will mention, we're open to any kinds of feedback as we are still a young podcast.
All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed the show, we really hope you'll follow or subscribe on whatever platform you're on. We'd really love it if you could leave us a good rating. It really helps the show and it helps us continue to create the show and helps other people find us. Please visit us on the web, renownedpodcast.com, or on social media at Renowned Podcast. And of course, tune in next week for a new episode with our new noun production. Have a great week.
Bye, everybody.